The moment Adrian Hale pulled the wedding ring off his wife's finger, the entire ballroom forgot how to breathe. 1 second earlier, the room had been glowing with wealth, music, and fake smiles. Crystal chandeliers spilled gold across marble floors. A live orchestra played softly beneath a ceiling painted like a European palace. Politicians, celebrities, investors, and old family elites stood around the stage with champagne in their hands, waiting for what they thought would be another polished Hale family announcement. Then Adrian reached for Serena's hand. At first, she thought he was about to make a gesture for the cameras. Something cold and performative maybe, but not cruel. Not this cruel. His fingers tightened around her left hand. Then, in front of hundreds of people, he slowly slid her wedding ring off her finger. A few guests gasped. Someone near the back laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke. But Adrian didn't look at his wife again. He turned, walked across the ballroom, and stopped in front of Vanessa Cole, the stunning younger woman who had been appearing beside him for months like a scandal everyone was too polite to name. Vanessa lifted her hand with a smile already forming on her lips, and Adrian placed Serena's wedding ring into his mistress's palm. The room exploded into whispers. A few shameless guests actually clapped. Others looked horrified. Serena stood frozen under the chandelier light, her bare finger trembling, her face drained of color. Tears rose into her eyes, but she didn't reach for him. She didn't plead. She didn't scream. Vanessa admired the ring like she had just been crowned queen. "I guess everyone knows now," she said softly, letting her voice carry just enough. The silence that followed should have belonged to Serena. Instead, it belonged to Adrian's mother. Margaret Hale stood up from her chair near the head table. She had been quiet all evening, elegant in black silk, her expression unreadable, like a woman watching a play whose ending she had known from the beginning. Most people in that ballroom assumed she supported her son. In families like the Hales, nothing public happened without the mother knowing. And because Margaret had said nothing when Adrian publicly humiliated his wife, everyone assumed her silence was approval. Then she took one step forward and said, "Stop." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The orchestra fell silent in the middle of a note. Conversations died instantly. Vanessa's smile faded when she noticed Margaret wasn't looking at Adrian. She was staring at the ring. Margaret's face changed in a way that chilled the entire room. And then, in a voice so calm it was terrifying, she said, "If you have any sense at all, you will put that ring down before you destroy more than one life tonight." The ballroom went still. Vanessa blinked. "Excuse me?" Margaret did not move her eyes from the ring. That ring was never his to give. Adrian let out a tired, irritated breath. "Mother, don't do this." Margaret finally looked at him, and whatever he saw in her face made his confidence flicker for the first time. "Oh, I'm afraid you already did it," she said. "You just gave away the one thing that proves your wife was the reason this family survived." Every guest in the ballroom went silent all over again. Vanessa slowly lowered her hand. Adrian frowned. "What are you talking about?" But Margaret didn't answer him immediately. She looked at Serena, and Serena, heartbreak written into every line of her face, gave the tiniest shake of her head. "Please don't," that look said. But Margaret had reached the end of her silence. The room felt different now. Heavier, sharper, dangerous. Because suddenly, the humiliating little scene everyone thought they had just watched no longer felt like scandal. It felt like a mistake. A catastrophic one. Serena swallowed, forcing herself to remain upright while the entire room stared at the empty space where her ring had been. She could feel the pity around her, the judgment, the hungry curiosity. She knew how these people worked. They would spend one day acting shocked, and the next 6 months repeating every detail over dinner tables and magazine lunches. But none of that hurt as much as Adrian's face. Not because he looked guilty, because he looked certain. Certain he had won. Certain she had lost. Certain he finally no longer needed the woman who had stood beside him through every storm. That certainty hurt more than betrayal. Vanessa tried to recover first. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," she said with a brittle smile. "Adrian and Serena's marriage has been over for a long time." Serena finally looked up. "Has it?" she asked quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut across the ballroom more cleanly than shouting would have. Vanessa's expression tightened. Adrian folded his arms. "Let's not pretend, Serena. We both know this has been dead for months." Serena's eyes held his. "Dead things don't bleed, Adrian." The sentence landed hard enough to make several guests glance at each other. Because she was right. Dead marriages don't leave wounds like the one on her face. Dead marriages don't create this kind of silence. Dead marriages don't make a room full of powerful people suddenly feel like intruders. Margaret stepped closer. "Vanessa," she said, "put the ring on the table." Vanessa laughed softly, but there was fear under it now. "Why?" "Because that ring is not jewelry," Margaret said. "And if you keep holding it, every person in this room is about to learn exactly how badly my son has misjudged the woman he married." The room shifted. Guests leaned in. Phones disappeared into pockets. Even the people who loved scandal more than oxygen knew they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than infidelity. Adrian's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous." "No," Margaret said. "Ridiculous was humiliating your wife in public. What comes next is truth." And truth, in rooms like this, was always the most expensive thing anyone could bring. Serena closed her eyes for a second. Not because she was weak, because she knew what would happen the moment Margaret started speaking. The private sacrifice she had spent years burying would be dragged under these chandeliers and laid out in front of people who had never earned the right to know it. But maybe that was the price of finally stopping the lie. Margaret turned slowly toward the guests. "You all think you came here tonight to witness a new beginning," she said. "You didn't. You came here to witness the exact second my son destroyed the only person who ever loved him without needing anything in return." A murmur moved through the crowd. Adrian tried to interrupt. "Mother!" "Be quiet." The two words hit him like a slap. No one in the room could remember the last time anyone had spoken to Adrian Hale that way. Margaret's voice remained calm. 5 years ago, after my husband died, Adrian inherited a company drowning in grief, debt, and panic. The press called him brave. The market called him bold. The board called him the future. But behind those headlines, this family was closer to collapse than any of you know. Now, older executives in the room started shifting uncomfortably. Because they remembered. The emergency meetings, the frozen credit lines, the disastrous expansion, the whispers that Hale International might not survive the year. Most people in the ballroom knew the public version of that crisis. They remembered Adrian's interviews, his speeches, the articles calling him a young titan who had saved the family empire. But Margaret's eyes moved to Serena, and suddenly, the shape of the lie began to appear. "What none of you were told," Margaret said,
is that my son did not save this family. The silence that followed was brutal.
He would have lost everything, she continued, if Serena had not stepped in. Every head turned toward Serena at once. She stood very still, one hand resting against her side, like she was holding herself together through sheer discipline. Adrian stared at her. No. Serena didn't speak. Margaret did. Yes. When our lenders pulled back, when payroll was at risk, when our board began preparing for an internal emergency restructuring, it was Serena who kept this family standing. Vanessa's face went pale. What does that even mean? It was Daniel Mercer, the Hale family attorney, who answered. He stepped forward reluctantly, already looking like a man who regretted being within 10 miles of the ballroom. It means Mrs. Hale is correct, he said. There were emergency financial protections put in place during the crisis. Adrian looked at him like he'd been slapped. Daniel! The attorney swallowed. Those protections were secured through private collateral arrangements and a restoration trust. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Whose collateral? No one answered right away. That silence answered him anyway. He slowly turned back toward Serena. Her eyes shone, but her posture never broke. Yours? He asked. She nodded once. The room erupted into whispers all over again. Vanessa took a half-step back from the ring. Adrian looked confused, offended, almost angry at reality itself. That's impossible. She didn't have that kind of money. Margaret's expression hardened. Not until she sold the company she built with her father. That one sentence shattered whatever remained of Adrian's certainty. Years earlier, before marriage, before gala photos and family expectations, and becoming Mrs. Hale, Serena Vaughn had built a fast-growing creative technology company with her father. It had been her dream, her inheritance, her future. After her father died, it became more than a business. It became the last living thing he had left her. And when Adrian's recklessness pushed the Hale empire toward collapse, Serena sold it. Quietly. Completely. Without a press release, without a speech, without asking for gratitude. She sold the life she had built, took the money, and used it to secure the emergency lifeline that saved Adrian's company, his reputation, his family name, and thousands of employees whose paychecks would have vanished if she had done nothing. Vanessa stared at Serena in disbelief. Adrian looked like he couldn't process the words. Why would you do that and never tell me? Serena finally answered. Because you were already breaking, she said softly. And I thought if I told you in the middle of that storm, you would hear humiliation instead of love. The room went dead quiet. Somewhere near the back, a woman wiped tears from beneath her lashes. A board member who had clapped earlier suddenly looked sick to his stomach. Adrian's throat moved. You sold your company? For me? For your employees, Serena corrected gently. For your mother. For the people who would have paid for your mistakes. And yes, for you. The way she said it made it worse. Not dramatic, not bitter, just true. Margaret took another step toward the ring lying on the table. And that is why the ring matters. Now every eye in the room dropped to it. At first glance, it was nothing extraordinary. Elegant platinum, old design, subtle craftsmanship. Wealthy families owned rings like that all the time. But now, under the weight of Margaret's voice, it looked different. Not decorative, symbolic, dangerous. When the Restoration Trust was created, Margaret said, the authority connected to that trust was bound to one family object, one seal, one protector. She pointed at the ring. That ring. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. Daniel Mercer exhaled slowly, like he had been dreading this exact moment for years. The Trust Protector's authority was tied to the seal inside the band, he confirmed. The numbers engraved within it identify the guarantor and protector of the Hale Restoration Trust. Adrian stared at him. Protector? Daniel nodded. Serena. There it was. The final shift. The ring Adrian had ripped from his wife's finger and handed to his mistress was not just a wedding band. It was proof. Proof that Serena was the one who had legally protected the family when everything was falling apart. Proof that her sacrifice was written into the very architecture of the empire Adrian claimed to have rebuilt. Proof that the woman he had just humiliated in public had been the silent foundation under his entire success. Vanessa stepped back so quickly she nearly knocked into a waiter. "You gave me that?" she whispered to Adrian. He looked at the ring like it had become a weapon. Margaret's eyes flashed. "No. He tried to give you what was never his. That's the difference." And suddenly, everyone in that ballroom could feel it. The real scandal wasn't the affair. It was that Adrian Hale had publicly exposed how little he understood about his own life, his own marriage, and the woman he had been standing on for years. The shame in the room deepened. Serena should have looked victorious. She didn't. She looked tired. Tired in the way only loyal people do when they finally stop hiding the damage. Vanessa's voice cracked. "Why didn't you ever use that against him?" Serena looked at her, and there was no malice in her face, only sadness. "Because I never wanted power over him," she said. "I wanted partnership." That line hit the room harder than any dramatic revelation so far. Because now, everyone could see the real story. She hadn't stayed because she was weak. She hadn't stayed because she was dependent. She hadn't stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She had stayed because she loved him. And she had loved him long past the point where he deserved it. Adrian took a step toward her. "Serena." But she lifted her eyes to stop him before he came any closer. There was no rage in them, and that somehow hurt him more. "You don't get to say my name like that now," she said. The words were quiet. They still cut him open. He froze. And for the first time all night, the billionaire heir who had walked into that ballroom with perfect confidence looked like a frightened little boy wearing a very expensive suit. Margaret continued, because she wasn't done. "There's more." A visible wave of tension ran through the room. More? How could there be more? Daniel Mercer looked like he wanted the floor to open and swallow him, but he spoke anyway. "There is a conduct clause in the Restoration Trust." Adrian turned sharply. "What conduct clause?" The attorney straightened. "Any public act that undermines the dignity of the trust protector, the seal, or the family's fiduciary stability can trigger emergency board review of executive authority." A long silence followed. Then Adrian went white. He understood it immediately. The board review wouldn't happen because he cheated. It would happen because he had publicly humiliated the very person whose sacrifice was legally tied to the family's rescue structure. In front of witnesses. In front of investors. In front of the very elites who would spread this story before sunrise.
He had not just embarrassed his wife. He had made himself look reckless, ungrateful, and unstable. In other words, dangerous. When? He asked, his voice suddenly dry. Margaret held his gaze. At midnight. The room almost swayed with the weight of that answer. Several board members looked down. Others avoided Adrian's eyes entirely. Vanessa looked at him as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a prize, not as a powerful man, but as someone who might be one mistake away from losing everything he had promised her. This isn't my fault, she said quickly. No one answered, because guilt had different faces tonight, and hers was only one of them. Adrian's was worse.
He turned back to Serena, panic beginning to fracture through the pride in his expression. You have to stop this. Serena almost smiled, not because it was funny, because after everything, he still thought she existed to save him. That's what I've been doing for years, she said. And look what it turned you into. He flinched. The sentence was not loud, but it hit like judgment. She stepped toward the table and picked up the ring. Her fingers trembled this time. Barely, but enough to tell the truth about how much it was costing her to remain this composed. She turned the band slowly between her fingers, looking at the hidden seal inside. And then, with all eyes on her, she slipped it back onto her own hand. The room seemed to exhale. Not because the marriage had been restored. It hadn't. But because something else had. Her dignity, her identity, her ownership of the truth. Adrian stared at her. You could have controlled everything this entire time. No, Serena said. I could have exposed everything. That's not the same thing. What did you want from me? He asked, and now there was real desperation in his voice. Finally. At the exact moment it no longer mattered. Serena looked at him for a long time. Then she said, I wanted the man I married to notice that I was disappearing. The ballroom went silent again. Because there it was. Beneath the betrayal, beneath the money, beneath the trust, the seal, the scandal, the board. The empire. That was the real wound. Not that he had fallen for another woman. That he had stopped seeing the one who had been quietly breaking right in front of him. Serena did not shout. She did not perform pain for the audience. She simply told the truth. I asked if you were happy, she said. I asked if we should get help. I asked if you still saw me. I sat across from you at dinners you barely attended. I waited through nights you came home smelling like someone else's perfume. I listened to you thank magazine covers, board members, and strangers for your success, while I sat beside you wearing the evidence of what it cost me. And every time I tried to reach you, you answered me with silence, gifts, or excuses. Adrian's eyes filled. She kept going. Do you know what the worst part was? She asked. He didn't answer. It wasn't the affair, she said. It was watching you become the kind of man who could betray me and still believe you were the victim. That broke the room open. Several guests looked down in shame. A socialite near the front wiped her face. Even Vanessa's composure cracked for a second. Because Serena wasn't just speaking to Adrian now. She was speaking to every person in that ballroom who had ever mistaken quiet loyalty for weakness. Vanessa folded her arms, struggling to recover control. "He told me your marriage was already over," Margaret replied before Serena could. Men who are still benefiting from their wives' sacrifice love to say that. A few people looked away to hide their reaction. Vanessa's face hardened, but the confidence was gone. "I didn't know." Serena turned to her, and in that moment, everyone expected fury. Instead, Serena gave her something much harder to receive: truth without hatred. "You knew enough," Serena said. "You just didn't care because the lie was flattering." Vanessa swallowed. That landed. Because it was true. She had seen the late-night messages, the secrecy, the coldness, the wife still in the picture, the unfinished business. She had ignored every warning sign because she wanted the ending she had imagined. Serena stepped closer. "You thought if you got the ring, you got the future," she said. "But all you got was proof that a man willing to betray his wife in public will eventually betray the fantasy he sold you to." Vanessa's eyes watered with humiliation. And for one brief second, she looked less like a villain and more like another person who had built her confidence on male attention and called it security. But Serena didn't soften the truth. "If you have any dignity left," she said, "leave before this becomes the only story anyone ever tells about you." The room held its breath. Vanessa looked at Adrian. He did not rescue her. He couldn't even rescue himself now. That was when she understood. She had not won anything. She had simply arrived in time to watch a man lose everything. Without another word, Vanessa turned and walked toward the ballroom doors. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble. The sound echoed through the silence like a countdown. No one stopped her. No one followed. The doors closed behind her. And just like that, the woman Adrian had humiliated his wife for was gone. All that remained was the damage. Adrian looked at Serena like a man stranded inside the wreckage of his own choices. "I didn't know," he whispered. Margaret's expression turned colder. "That is no longer an excuse. It is evidence." He looked at his mother then, truly looked at her, and saw no protection there, no strategy, no family machine moving in to save him from scandal. Only disappointment. Possibly for the first time in his life, Adrian Hale understood what it felt like to stand without cover. He turned back to Serena. "Why didn't you tell me everything?" She smiled sadly. "Because love should not have to submit invoices." That sentence would be repeated in that city for years. Love should not have to submit invoices, not itemize sacrifice, not beg for recognition, not produce receipts to prove its value. And yet, tonight, under 1,000 lights, Serena had been forced to do exactly that. Adrian's voice dropped lower. "Is there anything I can do?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Live long enough to understand what you threw away," she said. That answer shook him more than anger would have. Because there would be no dramatic revenge, no scream, no slap, no public destruction. Just consequences. Clean, quiet, total. Margaret moved to Serena's side, not in front of her as protector, not behind her as witness, beside her as equal. Then, finally, Margaret revealed the part that explained why she had stayed silent until the exact moment the ring left Serena's hand. "I promised her years ago that I would keep her secret," Margaret said to the room. "I kept it because she believed my son could still become the man she loved. I waited because I wanted him to discover her worth without needing humiliation to teach it to him. But the second he removed that ring and placed it in another woman's hand, he didn't just insult his wife. He declared himself unworthy of the sacrifice behind it." Her eyes glistened, but her voice never shook. That is why I spoke now. Because silence protects love. It should never protect cruelty. No one in the room could argue with that. Daniel Mercer glanced at his watch again. Time was moving. Midnight was coming. The board meeting would happen. Statements would be drafted. Calls would be made. Lawyers would spend the night trying to contain a truth too emotional to spin. But none of that mattered to Serena anymore. For years, she had lived inside a marriage where her loyalty was invisible until the moment it was nearly handed to someone else as decoration. Now the truth was out. And strangely, with truth came peace. Painful peace, but peace all the same. Adrian took another step toward her, his face stripped of the arrogance he'd walked in with. "Serena, please." She looked at him, really looked. At the man she had married, at the grief he had carried, at the ambition that had twisted into vanity, at the weakness disguised as confidence, at the love she had offered him over and over until it finally ran out. Then she said the one thing he deserved to hear. "I loved you most when you had the least," she said. "You loved yourself most when you had the most. That is why we did not survive." There was no answer to that. Because nothing in his billion-dollar vocabulary could buy a response big enough. Serena turned away from him. The movement was gentle, final. She took a breath, lifted her chin, and faced the ballroom one last time. Not as a discarded wife, not as a tragic woman in a silver dress, but as someone who had walked through humiliation without becoming smaller. And everyone could feel it. The room that had watched her lose her ring was now watching her reclaim herself. She reached for Margaret's hand and squeezed it once. "Thank you," she whispered. Margaret's face softened. "Forgive me for waiting." Serena shook her head. "You kept your promise." "And you kept all of us alive," Margaret replied. There was so much grief in those words that even people who had come for spectacle now looked away like they were intruding on something sacred. Serena released Margaret's hand. Then she said, "I'm leaving." Adrian's face crumpled. "Where will you go?" She gave the smallest, saddest smile. "Somewhere I won't have to disappear to be loved." Then she walked. And the ballroom parted for her. Billionaires, politicians, celebrities, socialites, board members, people who had once spoken over her, around her, through her. They all stepped aside. Because dignity has a force that power can never imitate. Her heels tapped softly against the marble floor as she crossed the ballroom alone. Not hurried, not shaky, not broken. The orchestra members stood motionless. The waiters held their trays in silence. The chandeliers still glittered overhead, but the room no longer belonged to wealth. It belonged to truth. At the doors, Serena paused. Not to look back. Not for Adrian. Just long enough to inhale the first honest breath she had taken in years. Then she walked out. The doors closed behind her, and the sound was so final that nobody moved for several seconds. Adrian remained under the chandelier, staring at the place where she had disappeared. His empire still existed, for the next few hours at least. His name still mattered. His suit still fit. His guests were still watching. And yet he had never looked poorer. Because the most devastating punishment in the world is not losing money. It is understanding, too late, Who loved you before you were worth loving? Margaret turned to face the room one last time. The silence around her was absolute. "Never confuse applause with loyalty," she said. "Applause belongs to moments. Loyalty belongs to character. If someone stands beside you when you are broken, honor them before success teaches you the arrogance to believe they always will." No one clapped. No one dared. The shame was too deep. One by one, guests began setting down their glasses and leaving in silence. Conversations would come later. Headlines would come later. Gossip would come later. But the lesson had already landed. A mistress could steal attention. A husband could steal peace. A crowd could steal privacy. But none of them could steal the value of a woman who had sacrificed everything and still refused to become cruel. By midnight, the board would gather. By sunrise, Adrian Hale would begin paying for a mistake the world had witnessed in high definition. Vanessa would spend the coming weeks learning that borrowed triumph never lasts. Margaret would carry the ache of raising a son who recognized love only after destroying it. And Serena would finally begin again. Not as the wife of a billionaire. Not as the silent protector of a family that failed her. Not as the woman in the background of someone else's success. But as herself. Whole. Seen. Free. And that was the part nobody in that ballroom expected. The husband had taken off her ring like he was taking away her power. But seconds later, his mother's secret revealed the truth. The ring had never been her power. She was.